Hi, I'm Alex Miller, and this is the Citi Institute podcast, where we explore the forces shaping finance, the global economy, and the way we all live and work. In each episode, we bring you insights from thought leaders and innovators driving change, helping you stay informed, navigate challenges, and seize opportunities in a rapidly evolving world. So today we're going to be exploring the dynamic world of global security and defense. We're going to be diving into the strategies, the technologies, and the geopolitical forces shaping global security and national resilience. We're also going to be discussing the latest innovations impacting defense in an ever-changing world.
Warfare is about the application of all levers of national and collective force in an integrated way, and that has not changed. So warfare has always been hybrid.
If countries need to increase their defense spending, they have three choices. One is to increase taxes, one is to reduce other services, and one is to increase borrowing.
I'm delighted and honoured to be joined today by General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, one of the UK's most senior military commanders and a leading NATO strategist, having served as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He's now retired, but with extensive operational experience in global conflict zones, Sir Adrian commanded troops at nearly every rank up to general, shaping collective defence and leading complex missions. Today, he's a senior associate fellow at RUSI and visiting professor at King's College London, where he shares his practical approach to building a holistic strategy and resilience for businesses and institutions. I'm also very pleased that we're joined today by Charles Armitage, who heads European Aerospace and Defence at Citi Research, who's widely recognised on Wall Street as one of the leading analysts of the defence industry. Sir Adrian, Charles, thank you both for joining. So, Sir Adrian, maybe first I could just ask you briefly to tell us a little bit about your career.
Yeah, so I started life during the Cold War in armour in Germany, and so understand that background. I then went into aviation and flew reconnaissance helicopters for 3 years, which was a hugely exciting role. Then I transferred to another branch of the military where I became involved in commanding freefall parachute forces, looking at strategic tasks overseas, all over the world, in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, as well as preparing for war fighting. I commanded the 1st Armoured Brigade into Basra in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq. I commanded the 1st Armoured Division in Germany, training troops for Afghanistan. I then was deputy commander of the NATO force in Afghanistan during the surge when we had 180,000 troops and nearly 1/3 Afghans involved in a huge campaign of stabilization and counterinsurgency. My final role in the regular army was as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so the number 2 officer in NATO and the senior military officer in NATO. And then in retirement, I went back down to the equivalent of lieutenant and joined the Royal Air Force Reserve to go back to flying aircraft. And I did that once every couple of weeks for the last 6 years or so, which has been an enormous pleasure. So the career still goes on.
How have interconnected global conflicts changed NATO's strategic priorities beyond Europe? And how does the alliance adapt to asymmetric or cyber threats without losing coherence or indeed speed of response?
I know the question is about outside Europe, but it's worth reminding people that the key priorities are, firstly, unity and cohesion within NATO, which is a sort of unstated upfront, and then deterrence of Russia. But we have just been through 20 years of our priority being what the Americans christened the global war on terror. NATO had command of 180,000 troops from 50 countries in Afghanistan at the peak of the operation there. And so naturally, our focus transferred from deterrence to counterinsurgency and stabilization. And certainly as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, my push was to try and get people at the same time as everything else was going on to look south, and particularly to Africa, the Sahel region, where there's considerable instability right now. So today's priorities are, of course, Russia, within Europe, and over into Asia, because Russia's a big place. We are very mindful of counterterrorism and countering extremism worldwide, and the effect of stability on the access to the global commons, because most nations in NATO have very global economies which are reliant on access to those things. And of course, in the background is the growing phenomenon of China, and whether that becomes really an enemy or whether it stays as an aggressive competitive entity.
Do you think we're seeing a renaissance of so-called conventional deterrence, or is that just a temporary swing? And even then, presumably it's changing rapidly when we think about the emergence of drones.
One of the things that's been very misunderstood about the nature of warfare in the last 20 or 30 years, which has critically affected our national and collective strategy for the worse, is the assumption that warfare is all about fighting forces. Warfare is about the application of all levers of national and collective force in an integrated way. And that has not changed. So warfare has always been hybrid. And successful prosecutors of warfare have understood that. But the nature of hybrid warfare has changed in the recent decades. The nature of communication has exploded into all sorts of different areas. The existence of web-based communications was not a thing when I joined NATO. Space-based warfare has become much more prominent. Information, space, and cyber have become part of that hybrid mix in a very different way. But in order to prosecute warfare, you have to integrate the effects from all those areas. The problem for NATO in particular is that NATO is a military headquarters. It's brilliantly strategic in its outlook, but it vitally needs to integrate all the other strategies that create grand strategy: economic, informational, developmental, you name it. And therefore, another theme when I was Deputy DSACEUR was achieving some sort of integration with the EU. For most countries within NATO, they deal with the politics and all the other stuff which needs to be integrated. That has not yet been achieved. So we've had to refocus on deterrence of Russia in our home region. Nuclear deterrence is now very much back in focus and needs to be sufficient to deter against vastly more sophisticated potential opposition capabilities. And then the whole informational and cyber and space-based sector needs to be integrated as well. So there has been a renaissance because of the attention paid to it, and the nature of deterrence is the same, but the constituent parts have grown and disproportionately in certain places.
So, Adrian, you could help our listeners think about what I believe is a framework that certainly NATO thinks about in terms of communication, capabilities, credibility, in terms of being able to, I guess, assess or deter potential aggressors. Because there must be a lot of different frameworks that in your time as Deputy Supreme Commander you had to sort of think about in terms of that hybrid warfare.
Essentially, if you stick to the basics of how the military do decision-making, I think it applies to all circumstances, and I think within business it works potentially really, really well. The first requirement is to do your mission analysis, to work out, well, firstly, to listen to what you're being told to achieve, and then to read into it further and work out from that what the specified tasks are, but what the implied tasks are, and then analyze that and come back to the person who's given you the mission with a restated mission statement that says what you now understand they really want you to do. And a mission statement should contain an in order to. In military terms, I need to take that chunk of country in order to provide a launch pad for something else. The other thing that is an absolute given in NATO thinking is that you should understand not just what your boss wants, but what your boss's boss wants. You also need to know how his task fitted into the next higher level of command, the next higher level of objective, so that if you are not getting correct instructions, you can move on and use initiative.
Charles, maybe I could bring the discussion to you. When you think about how NATO requirements are increasing, obviously there's the new goal of 3.5% of GDP on defense by 2035, plus I think it's 1.5 on security-related infrastructure. And I'm sure there's a debate around the definitions there. Do you think there's real credibility to these commitments from all member states, or are some perhaps trying to find ways to maybe, let's say, not do all the spending they're expected to? And maybe it's not just about spending, maybe it's the credibility to act as well.
Ultimately, it comes down to Sir Adrian's comments about what do we want to achieve. And I'll come back to your specific question. But if we flip that on its head and put our minds into Vladimir Putin's head and say, what does he want to achieve? I would posit that he has three strategic priorities. First is to increase his grip in domestic Russia. Secondly is to increase his zone of influence. And thirdly is to eliminate NATO as a credible deterrent. On the first, he's succeeded massively. On the second, he's done a bit. And on the third, I think the jury's still out, which I'd like to sort of lay open the idea. On one hand, Sweden, which has been neutral for 250 years, is now no longer neutral. Finland is post-Finlandization has now become part of NATO. And Sir Adrian mentioned unity, which I think is almost synonymous with credibility as well. Something that I'm trying to figure out is how can NATO deter Putin from doing the following? If he puts troops a couple of miles into East Estonia, and NATO and equally relevantly the EU respond as they should, he says, my bad, no problem, withdraw the troops, nothing lost, maybe a few men. If NATO doesn't respond as it should, NATO ceases to exist as a credible deterrent, I would posit. So the question is how does NATO move what appears to be a low-risk, high-reward plan for Putin to being a high-risk, low-reward plan? And I'm not quite sure I've got the answer to that. So, Sir Adrian, any thoughts on how that change in credibility or unity might work?
I mean, I think the answer comes back to asymmetry. Deterrence consists of three elements. It's the protection of our vital ground. And that's not just physical ground. It's ideas, it's political systems, it's ethical foundations. So we have to protect all of that. We have to ensure there is resilience. So if any of those things are attacked in any way, we can recover very quickly and therefore make the attack worthless. And most importantly, there needs to be an element of cost to an aggressor for any aggressive action in any domain. So in the scenario that Charles paints, where there's a modest physical incursion into Estonia, the first requirement is an immediate and devastating military response in order to deliver the status quo ante and to eliminate that incursion, because a festering frozen conflict is highly undesirable. Secondly, along with that comes a devastating, painful impact in every other area. So sanctions, political impact on Putin as a leader, diplomatic activity, potentially quite aggressive action in the cyber and space domains, which is something we're not used to doing because we're very mindful of not upping the tension. But in the face of an overt aggressive movement like that, things become more justifiable. And what we try and do is modulate the response to cause pain without taking us up the escalation ladder. And of course, Putin will always try and achieve escalation dominance. You know, it's a desirable thing in this sort of warfare anyway, but he'll try and get to a level where we won't dare to match him or even go beyond for fear of unleashing the Third World War.
If countries need to increase their defense spending, they have three choices. One is to increase taxes, one is to reduce other services, and one is to increase borrowing. Countries like Sweden and Germany are in the lucky position of being able to increase borrowing, but the rest of Europe can't. So, again, I would posit that we are in a very risky position because unless we can persuade the voters, which ergo the politicians will then follow suit, that we need to increase defense spending, arguably we're at an impasse. We can't, and those other areas of inflicting pain that you were talking about have already happened in Western Europe. You know, the UK is unlikely to be invaded. France is unlikely to be invaded. So how are we going to motivate the population or get the population to understand that if we don't protect Estonia, Latvia, the Baltics, how do we persuade people that this is an important thing to do?
I think the other point to make is that for everybody watching this, you know, you are part of deterrence. You are part of national and collective deterrence, because what you believe and what you advocate with respect to defense spending as a voter is really important. And B, the way you ensure that your business, your enterprise, your personal life, your household is resilient. That is all contributing to our resilience as a nation and is part of deterrence. You know, we're building a society which is just not resilient, and it's unnecessary, and it's up to you to push back on it. When you hire a car, you should ask, has it got a spare wheel? The answer will be no, obviously, because they don't trust you to change it. But we should change that. We're becoming an unresilient society. It sounds incredibly trivial, but add all those trivial things up, and the net result is a society which would just be shattered and traumatized with anything remotely similar to war, which is why, of course, I think that people saying we are at war with Russia as a hybrid war is okay in one sense, but it's not particularly helpful, because if people think this is war, God help them if it ever happens.
One of the things that we've heard a lot about is obviously, you know, drones and how that's become, you know, an important element of the war. And perhaps this is first to you, Sir Adrian. What's the risk that the defence spending that starts coming through, such as it is, debated as it is, ends up fighting the last war in terms of where expenditure goes? How do you sort of see that evolving?
I would say that with respect to drones and AI applied to warfare, you know, we're in a very fast-moving evolutionary state where the aggressor has an advantage because defensive systems haven't been properly developed. And we need to be really, really careful about the conclusions we're taking, particularly non-practitioners loudly trumpeting, you know, conclusions, which they really ought to have a little better understanding of before they do. There is also laser technology coming on board, which is getting much smaller, much more efficient. You know, this is going to change hugely, but the requirement to get people, get soldiers, the poor B infantrymen forward to defend ground is still a feature of the Ukraine war. And men on the ground, holding ground, is still critical to defense, and giving them armored protection will remain critical. It's a question of how we integrate all the effects together to turn the balance. And the answer is, don't base spending on what's happening today. Look forward, anticipate future developments, and let our army experiment and train properly and evolve.
Charles, what about to the point that Sir Adrian was making? How do defence industries balance investing in the cutting edge technology that, clearly that there's a need to do so, whilst maintaining the core? I'm not sure if legacy systems is the right phrase, but sort of what they've always done.
With difficulty. I think the tank was obsolesced in 1970 after 1 year. It's coped pretty well since then. The rearming of Europe white paper came out last year. 70% of casualties were caused by artillery, and lo and behold, two of the 7 strategic priorities were artillery and ammunition. This drones is causing 70% of the casualties in Ukraine. We need to think about it, as you say, go out and test things. The other challenge is if you have swarms of drones, you need a lot of drones in a store, in a warehouse. But the product life cycle of a drone or the communication system of a drone is about a month. So there's absolutely no point in having hundreds of thousands of drones sitting in a warehouse, taking them out and suddenly discovering they don't work because they've been hacked. So the company that cracks how to update drones, and it's almost certainly going to be software that makes these drones viable and storable, that you can use them when they want to come out, is going to be the winner.
Charles flagged up a conundrum that defense buyers face, which is that, we've got all the new kit to buy and the legacy kit as well. You never completely replace one nature of capability with the others. It tends to be an overlap, and it's the overlap which gives you the overall capability which you need. So it gets more expensive. How can we possibly save anything on that? Governments look for efficiencies, and they look to structures and number of people. In the end, if we don't deter Russia and avoid war with them, we're all finished. So it's got to succeed. I mean, the Russians as well, by the way. And they understand that, fortunately, which is a good thing. So deterrence has got to succeed. So the next conflict we're actually in, by definition, is not going to be the peer-on-peer conflict with Russia that we're all preparing for and have to because of deterrence. It'll be something else. So you need lots of generalist forces that can do everything from peace support operations through stabilization to pretty aggressive counterinsurgency. And that needs lots of people who can work in environments where there are populations, who can interact with them in the way that drones can't. So you need lots of capable people. Okay, so further undermining the strength of armed forces is not an option. We've gone too far. What we can do, though, I chair a conference on armored vehicles every new year, and my colleagues in industry tell me that the UK defence procurement system is more bureaucratic and difficult to work with than any other they work with by a factor of 5. Now, they might be exaggerating, but not much. And this is costing us a lot of money. What can you do listening? Well, where you sit in your business, push back. Push back on bureaucracy, on unnecessary, ridiculous bureaucracy. And through your representatives, advocate to government to make things easier. And certainly in defense, if we don't achieve it, we're in danger of not deterring. And we put everybody in jeopardy.
Maybe I could sort of just pivot our conversation a little bit here. And could you talk to us, Adrian, about how you see AI and perhaps AI autonomy beginning to, maybe already, or perhaps in the future, shaping command decisions? Will we ever get to the stage where we trust algorithms with legal and lethal authority? How do you think sort of the thinking is evolving in this space?
This is an area of real danger in defense. There is an inevitability, and I would say that without a shadow of a doubt, that we are going to see lethal systems, including some of the most dangerous and most lethal, being activated by AI rather than people. Because in the era of hypersonics and with decision timings being reduced massively, if we don't go there, we're going to be behind the curve. And so we need to be thinking ahead. And for example, systems need to have the ability built in to disable them until quite late in their attack path, if you like. Not necessarily a physical one, but sometimes an entirely digital one. And we need to also, I think, improve military-to-military communication. Now, you all know the importance of communication in business. I mean, it's very interesting that in 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea, one of the first political kind of knee-jerk reactions, and I say it in a slightly derogatory way, but I do understand what politicians were trying to signal, was the ceasing of all routine military-to-military links with Russia. You know, some of us held our head in our hands at that stage, because when you're entering times of tension, you need the channels of communication to be open, because ridiculous things happen in warfare, mistakes are made, daft situations emerge out of nowhere, and the ability to pick up a phone or communicate in real time is vital, and we need that. So I'm sure the same occurs in business, but those sorts of safeguards are not in place now, and they need to be. The other thing is the sort of air defense safeguards that we had during the Cold War. I flew helicopters years ago. If we wanted to go near the inner German border, we had to call up a call sign who then communicated to the Warsaw Pact what we were doing. All that stuff has been deconstructed and needs rebuilding in a fashion.
I know Citi Research in their public must-see series, Money and Might, had talked about sort of AI being able to unify as much as anything the different parts of the armed services, to be able to help decision-making be faster, quicker, more integrated.
First of all, you need to understand what your superior wants and what his superior wants. Then it sounds to me like there's going to have to be a much clearer logic chain about how those decisions are made, because if they're being made by a computer, the soft factors have to be written hard, so to speak. The other interesting comment I found fascinating was, if you can empirically prove that a machine is better at targeting decisions, as in lower false negatives and lower false positives than a human, it is unethical not to use the machine. Which I follow the logic, but does sound like a slippery slope. And I'm not sure how one controls that, how far down that slope one goes.
Yes, it's not unlike the debate in healthcare, where is it sort of unethical not to use AI in healthcare if you can get empirically proven better outcomes. Charles, just staying with you, just regarding, I guess, sort of how Europe's going to think about its future. Do you think we're looking at some sort of golden dome type scenario, or is it more what Sir Adrian's mentioned in terms of this hybrid warfare?
I suspect that a golden dome, there's no golden bullet. You want to have layered defense with the probability of doing what you want is far higher if you have three 80% domes rather than one 95% dome. So sort of vying for perfection is probably not the way to go. It's probably going to have to be, as I said, layered, very long range, very expensive, right the way down to short range, and really very cheap. If you can put $5,000 drones and you're forcing the enemy to shoot them down with $3 million Patriots, you are going to win that war on the economic basis.
So, Adrian, anything you would add to that or challenge even?
When nations and entities are looking at using force to achieve their political ends and resorting to warfare, they need to consider whether they can afford for it to become an economic war. The intent of the Russians in Ukraine was to win that war without it ever becoming an economic war. Their intent was to effectively carry out a hybrid coup de main, seizure of Kiev and the levers of control, and then somehow suppress the nation having got control of the government. That just didn't work out for them for a variety of reasons, including lack of planning and a system which was shot through with corruption and inefficiency, which was the bit that we couldn't see as as military commanders looking at. What we could see was the capability. We didn't see the morale and the moral turpitude. So it wasn't meant to go the way it has. Ukraine has now become more of an economic war. Day after day, we're hearing that the Russians are under pressure there. It remains to be seen if they really are. But in the future, Russia will undoubtedly seek to achieve their objective in a way that does it quickly without settling back into a long slogging match. And so economic warfare becomes less of a factor than your strength at the time, and in particular, your ability, because warfare is always has been about delivering asymmetry, curiously enough. People talk about asymmetric warfare as if it's a new thing. What you've always sought to do in warfare at the tactical, operational, and strategic level is achieve asymmetry in time and space. And Russia will continue to seek to do that. So what we've got to do is counter that with superiority in time and space, not necessarily in symmetric capability.
I think there are a couple of points there. One is that may be what Russia seeks to do. And then the other thought is whether Russia can actually afford to stop the war, or rather Putin can afford to stop the war. He is on a war economy. If the war stops and sanctions don't come back, potentially the economy collapses. And so therefore, he has to look in other places for areas of aggression, bringing us back to my comments about the Baltics.
So, Adrian, maybe share with us a few of your insights in terms of military leadership, perhaps what's most misunderstood about military leadership in the current 21st century, and perhaps what might translate well into corporate executive roles, or whoever's listening to this podcast, how they might draw something from that experience.
Well, without doubt, the most misunderstood thing about military leadership is this assumption that in the military, you bark an order and everybody jumps. And yes, there are times when you do that, and there's lots of war films where you see people doing that. But normal military leadership does not work like that, emphatically. Normal military leadership employs mission command. It's this point about understanding what you're trying to achieve, understanding the moral and legal background to that, down to the lowest tactical level. The soldier on the ground needs to understand why it is that we're trying to change the regime in Iraq and why that's a legal and moral thing to do. Lots of arguments about the reality of that, but at least they need an understanding of what we believe is the case. And they also need to have some sort of explanation as to why it is that the way that you are choosing to achieve that objective is going to result in the least risk to them. They need to understand the logic of the decision-making, because what you're almost invariably about to do in warfare is ask people to risk their lives. And what they will wish to know is that their lives are not going to be sold needlessly. Mission command for everything other than the white heat of tactical action is critical. Now, mission command only works when people understand how to do things, because what you're saying to them is, this is what I want you to do. These are the resources you've got. These are your constraints. You come back to me and and restate my mission in language that you understand, and I'll confirm it, which often means changing the mission, surprisingly. And then I'll leave you to get on with it. I'll monitor closely, but I'm not going to interfere. You can't do that with people who don't really understand how to do stuff. So people have got to be really well trained. They've got to know the drills instinctively and apply on top of drills intelligence and common sense. And getting to that stage with a workforce is brilliant when you achieve it. But up until that stage, you need to intervene with a little bit of directive control. And directive control, I would say, does not work well in the boardroom or in the civilian workplace. And the answer is you've got to allow for your system to work on mission command by thorough training and enablement of people, empowerment to make decisions. And, one of the worst negative effects is IT systems which prevent you from taking a certain action or coming up with a certain answer. So the person at the end of the telephone who's giving you the answer off their screen can't go to where common sense would take them because the system won't let them. You've got to develop the go-arounds for that and give people the power to make decisions, give them the training to do so and trust them to do so and accept that mistakes will happen. But your machine will work much better.
The World Economic Forum asks C-suite leaders around the world what are the concerns they most have over the next 2 and 10 years, and misinformation, disinformation in particular, often cited. In this sort of age of polarization that we live in, and I guess we might call it information warfare to an extent, how do you think about sort of building that moral resilience, for want of a better word, in your young officers, the men and women who represent, in this case, the UK Army, but any army, I guess? And I guess, how do you think that role of failure has a part to play in the development and growth of your officer and the executive class?
I think, firstly, in terms of developing moral courage and moral resilience, you need to use ethics and morality as a baseline for everything you do. Now, in the military, what we do is we test leaders up front. And so you get them exhausted, you face them with a lot of problems. And underneath all of those problems is a moral and ethical question. And at some stage or another, you face them with a dilemma. Do you go for mission success or do you obey the law? And there are shades of gray. It's how they interpret the shades of gray that's important. But if they don't meet the moral standard, they're not acceptable. And I think in business, it's the same, what's more important, getting that figure at the bottom line or doing it ethically on a morally decent platform. And I think, you need to test business leaders in the same way.
Yes, the last 15 years have been clear on that, haven't they? Yes.
Moral courage is important. You need to say what you think about people honestly and be able to in their assessments without being at risk of, some negative response which is going to wreck your career. And fairness, care of people needs to be at the forefront. And finally, I've come back to courage as being kind of physical courage. Will you go over the top when there are bullets flying? Reputational courage. Will you put your reputation on the line in going for an unusual way of tackling a problem, which might fail, but which you deem to be worth the risk? And moral courage, will you stand up for right in the face of the sort of pressures that people face now, which are legion? I mean, if you think of the sort of pressures that are applied regarding matters of equality and diversity, which sometimes get very skewed in the workplace to the detriment of fairness, one needs to stand up and be assured that you are fair, that you do allow everybody, whoever they are, to have their say and be treated properly. But nevertheless, when people are found wanting, it shouldn't be a reason for not flagging things up. So moral courage is really difficult, and I think it's become more difficult in the workplace.
So Adrian, thank you. Charles, thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a fantastic discussion, so much to unpack. Sir Adrian talking about this notion of hybrid warfare, really emphasizing the fact that warfare isn't just about what we think of as conventional tanks and the likes. It's inclusive as an all-nation effort, whether it's cyber defenses, acting against misinformation, disinformation. The whole approach is something that really struck me. Charles there really emphasizing that for defense companies and the defense industry, there's a balance to be struck. The risk of fighting the last war, but the need to be fighting the next war, and echoing very much what Sir Adrian said, that you have to have a range of capabilities to be able to be ready for whatever that next threat may be. And I think probably lastly, what we heard from Sir Adrian in terms of courage, something that really resonated, I think, in a boardroom and in a corporate context. It's not just physical courage, but it's the courage to put your reputation on the line, to back ideas when not everyone's ready to back them. And of course, that has to be grounded in moral courage as well, something that really, I think, echoes for many of our listeners. And of course, there's a huge amount more that you can unpack in the Citi Research must-see Money and Might, which actually has two fantastic reports published over the last 12 months, which unpacks the future of warfare and how the defence industry and nation states and we as citizens need to evolve in that context.
The speaker's views are their own and may not necessarily reflect the views of Citi or any of its affiliates. All opinions are subject to change without notice. Neither the information provided nor any opinion expressed constitutes a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. The expressions of opinion are not intended to be a forecast of future events or a guarantee of future results.